Please subscribe the channel, like, and share the video for more video. Hey everyone, tonight, we're drifting back through time, across oceans, and gently into the misty, pine-scented hills of feudal Japan. So get comfortable. Dim the lights. Let the day loosen its grip a little. Nothing urgent is happening anymore. It's just you, a calm voice, and several centuries of people making very predictable mistakes while wearing impressive robes. Feudal Japan is one of those historical settings that arise preloaded with stereotypes. Samurai with perfect posture, silent ninjas lurking in the rafters, stoic lords staring thoughtfully at gardens, while composing poetry about must. And, naturally, everyone is either impossibly honorable or deeply scheming, often both before lunch. Tonight, we're going to gently unpack those stereotypes, not to shatter them completely, because that would require effort, but to see where they came from, why they stuck, and how reality was, as usual, quieter, messier, and significantly more disappointing. So let's begin, slowly, with the stereotype that looms largest of all. The samurai, the samurai.com/noble, and permanently serious, except when they want the popular image of the samurai is very specific. A tall, disciplined warrior, immaculate armor, a sword that has been folded exactly 1,000 times, because fewer folds would be good. He speaks rarely, but when he does, it's devastatingly wise. And yes, sometimes, this was true. But only sometimes, and usually not on weekdays. In reality, samurai were a warrior class that evolved over many centuries. Early on, they were essentially mounted archers, who happened to be very good at surviving chaos. The calm sword master image came later, after generations of civil war had finally exhausted everyone involved. Most samurai spent far more time doing paperwork than dueling rivals at sunset. They were bureaucrats with swords, tax collectors who also happened to be armed to the teeth, and like all bureaucrats, they complained constantly. Many samurai were deeply underpaid. By the peaceful Tokugawa period, warfare had slowed dramatically, but the samurai payroll had not been updated to reflect this. So you had thousands of professional warriors, with no wars and very limited income. This led to a surprising number of samurai running side businesses, teaching calligraphy, running small schools, quietly borrowing money they could not repay. Some even opened shops, which was technically beneath their status, but hunger has a way of relaxing social rules. The stereotype of unwavering honor, often summarized by the term bushido, is also more complicated than it sounds. Bushido, as a formalized code, was largely written down after the most violent periods were already over. It's a bit like writing a very strict rule book for behavior, once everyone is too tired to break the rules anymore. Actual samurai behavior varied wildly. Some were genuinely principled, others were opportunistic, petty, or deeply corrupt. A few were both, depending on the day. And yes, ritual suicide seppuku was real, but it was not a daily occurrence, despite what films might suggest. Most samurai preferred, quite reasonably, to stay alive and continue complaining about their stipends. So while the calm, noble samurai exists, he's sharing space with another figure, the anxious, detritus samurai, staring at his rice allowance and wondering where it all went wrong. The ninja, shadowy assassins, or mildly sneaky freelancers. Next, let's gently tiptoe over to the ninja, or rather, the idea of the ninja. Popular culture presents ninja as supernatural beings, invisible, silent, always dressed in black, despite black being a very noticeable color at night. Historically, this is optimistic. Ninja were not a separate mystical class. They were specialists, scouts, spies, saboteurs, people hired to gather information or cause problems discreetly. They came from ordinary backgrounds. Farmers, low-ranking warriors, people who needed the money, and they did not dress in all black. That outfit comes from Japanese theater, where stagehands wore black to signal nimbus. Over time, audiences began associating that look with stealth itself. Real ninja wore whatever helped them blend in. Peasant clothing, merchant robes, these sort of outfits that screamed, "I belong here, please ignore me," which, honestly, is far more effective. Most ninja activities involve patience rather than acrobatics. Watching roads, listening to conversations, waiting in uncomfortable positions for very long periods of time. Not exactly the stuff of thrilling montages. They were also not constantly fighting samurai. Often, they worked for them. A ninja was a tool, and like all tools, they were praised when useful and ignored when not. So the image of the lone, hyperlethal assassin leaping across rooftops is mostly fantasy. The reality was quieter, more awkward, and involved a lot more waiting in bushes. The daimyo, powerful lords with surprisingly fragile egos. Now let's drift upward, socially speaking, tode daimyo. These were the regional lords. The big names, the men with land, armies, and a deep concern about what other lords were doing. The stereotype here is of wise, dignified rulers, men of vision and strategy, carefully managing their domains while sipping tea and contemplating eternity. And again, sometimes, but daimyo were also intensely competitive, paranoid, and prone to sudden overreactions. Feudal Japan was shaped by long periods of fragmentation, where loyalty was fluid and betrayal was practically a hobby. So the daimyo learned early to trust no one completely, especially not their relatives. Many daimyo maintained elaborate spy networks. They monitored vassals, neighbors, and even their own households. A dinner invitation could be a political maneuver. A marriage proposal could be a threat. And speaking of marriages, were rarely romantic. They were strategic, coldly negotiated, and occasionally disastrous. A daimyo might marry his daughter to a rival clan to secure peace, then spend the rest of his life worrying that her children would one day invade him, which, sometimes, they did. Despite their power, daimyo lived under constant pressure. One wrong decision could mean rebellion, execution, or forced retirement in a month. So while they projected calm authority, many were quietly unraveling beneath the silk. Think less serene warlord, and more overworked middle manager with an army. Their shogun, the man running the country, while pretending not to at the very top of the military hierarchy sat. The shogun, technically subordinate to the emperor, practically in charge of everything that mattered. The stereotype of the shogun is absolute authority, a single figure controlling the nation with iron discipline. And yes, the shogun was powerful, but the job came with its own unique anxieties. A shogun had to keep the daimyo in line without pushing them too far. Too much freedom meant rebellion. Too much control meant rebellion slightly later. So the Tokugawa shogunate developed an elegant solution: mandatory attendance. Daimyo were required to spend alternating years in the capital. Their families stayed there permanently as guests, which everyone understood meant This system, senkin kata, was effective but exhausting. It drained daimyo finances and kept them busy with logistics instead of plotting coups. The stereotype of the shogun as a distant tyrant ignores how much of his job was administrative budgets, protocols, ceremonies, endless ceremonies. Power, it turns out, is mostly meetings. The emperor divine, invisible, and politely ignored. Now let's talk about the emperor, often imagined as a god-king radiant and revered. Historically, yes, divine, but also largely powerless. For much of feudal Japan, the emperor existed in Kyoto, performing rituals and maintaining legitimacy. He was essential symbolically. Politically, he was sidelined. The emperor did not command armies. He did not set policy. He endorsed decisions made by others, which made him both sacred and strangely irrelevant. Emperors often lived in relative poverty compared to military rulers. Their courts preserved ancient traditions, while the real action happened elsewhere. So while the stereotype suggests supreme authority, the reality was closer to ceremonial, a living symbol, carefully protected, gently ignored. It's a reminder that being divine does not necessarily pay well. Peasants, silent, obedient, and exhausted finally. Let's glance at the majority of the population. The peasants. The stereotype is simple: hardworking, silent, oppressed. And yes, life was difficult. Taxes were heavy. Famine was a constant threat. Most people lived close to the edge. But peasants were not passive. They resisted in small ways. They negotiated, they revolted. Occasionally, when things became unbearable, they also laughed, gossiped, celebrated festivals, lived full, emotional lives, despite the pressure from above. History often flattens them into background scenery, but they were very much present, and very aware of the absurdities of those ruling them. As we gently come to the end of this first drifting chapter, we can see that feudal Japan, like all historical periods, was less polished than its legends. Samurai worried about money. Ninja waited around a lot. Lords stressed endlessly. Emperors smiled politely while being ignored, and everyone, in their own way, was just trying to get through the day without causing a catastrophe. In the next part, we'll drift deeper into the personal lives behind these roles. The habits, the anxieties, the quiet disappointments that never make it into epic tales. But for now, just rest here for a moment. Let the armor clink softly in the distance. Let the paperwork pile up unnoticed. History will still be here when you wake up. Hey, everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back across continents, from the misty hills of Japan to the grand, drafty castles of Europe. So pour yourself a soft drink, fluff your pillows, and let the echoes of courtly life settle around you. We're about to gently explore royal marriages, the ones that went spectacularly wrong, and, unsurprisingly, often resulted in very strange genetics. Because, of course they did. Royal marriages were rarely about love. They were political tools, weapons in silk gloves, contracts that occasionally produced heartbreak, intrigue, or horrifying facial features. Let's start with a family you may have heard of. The Habsburgs. The Habsburg jaw. A family business, the Habsburgs were masters of inbreeding. Not figuratively, they literally married cousins, uncles, nieces, anyone with a compatible family tree. Their motto could have been, why meet new people when you can just marry your relatives? And yes, it worked politically. Territories merged, dynasties strengthened, but genetic less so. The most famous result is the Habsburg jaw, a prominent lower jaw, often accompanied by misaligned teeth, sometimes severe enough to make eating a bit of a struggle, which is admittedly a subtle reminder that political acumen does not guarantee dental health. Charles II of Spain is a particularly tragic example. He inherited every possible genetic complication from generations of He was weak, ill, and infertile. Some historians gently note that he spent most of his life lying in bed, being very uncomfortable, an extreme case of politics triumphing over biology. Henry VIII. From charming prince to, well, Henry VIII of England is famous, mostly for divorces and executions. He had 6 wives, and let's drift slowly through that chaos. He started as a lively, charming young man, skilled in music, sports, and fashion. But like many royals, his reproductive success was his true measure. His first marriage to Catherine of Aragon lasted a surprisingly long time, but the lack of a male heir gnawed at him. And so began a series of marriages that were politically useful, personally messy, and occasionally lethal. Anne Boleyn was executed. Jane Seymour, while successful in childbirth, died, giving birth to Edward VI. Other marriages were annulled or ended with quiet desperation. Henry's story is a gentle, cautionary tale. When reproduction becomes a political imperative, chaos is guaranteed. The Mad Queen, Maria, the first of Portugal, offers us Maria, aisi, became queen, naturally, because of her family lineage. She married her uncle. Yes, literally. It is easier to track in a family tree if everyone's path leads back to one branch. Maria's mental health deteriorated over time, whether due to genetics, grief, or the immense pressure of ruling. She became known as Maria the Mad. Her reign saw her withdrawing from public life, talking to imaginary companions, and experiencing visions. Royalty was meant to be glamorous. Instead, Maria reminds us that close family ties can sometimes be emotionally disastrous. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. Miscommunication royalty. No discussion of unfortunate royal marriages is complete without the French royals. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. He was shy, indecisive, and apparently confused by basic human interaction. She was lively, extravagant, and naturally assumed everyone loved her as much as she loved herself. Together, they formed a gentle train wreck. They had children, yes, but their reign coincided with a time when taxes were high, bread was scarce, and public patience was thin. Political marriage was meant to stabilize alliances, not spark revolution. And yet, they had 2 things in common with almost all royals. They were under immense pressure, and they were constantly observed, judged, and, inevitably, found wanting. Elizabeth of Bavaria and Franz Joseph, a marriage of appearances moving to Austria-Hungary. We find Franz Joseph and Elizabeth of Bavaria, Sissi, as she was known. She was famous for her beauty, her elaborate hairstyles, and her astonishingly tiny waist. And she was miserable. Their marriage was politically perfect, but emotionally hollow. Franz Joseph was dutiful, formal, and deeply attached to his throne. Elizabeth, less so. She traveled constantly, avoided court, and pursued obsessive beauty regimens. Their children suffered. 2 of them died young. 1 committed suicide, and 1 lived in constant pressure to produce heirs. Elizabeth's life, despite fairy tale trappings, was quietly tragic. She shows us that appearances do not equal happiness, even in a gilded cage. When genetics and ambition collide. Across Europe, royal families, repeatedly married cousins. Why? Political stability. Because marrying outside one's circle was dangerous, unpredictable, or simply too inconvenient. The result, predictably, was genetic oddities and often tragic personal lives. Habsburgs with protruding jaws, Spanish monarchs with fragile health, interconnected families quietly unraveling beneath the surface. It's oddly comforting to think that even the most powerful, seemingly glamorous people were vulnerable. Their palaces did not shield them from inherited disease, mental strain, or look. The gentle irony of royal life. Royalty is often depicted as glamorous, towering halls, lavish banquets, glittering jewelry, endless influence. But the reality? Drafty castles, endless paperwork, pressure to marry strategically, pressure to produce heirs, and, of course, the subtle, long-term consequences of marrying your second cousin 3 times in a row. The contrasts are quietly hilarious if you look at them slowly. A king feared public rebellion while secretly suffering from tooth pain caused by centuries of inbreeding. A queen wore pearls and silk while whispering to imaginary companions in the corners of her palace. All of it reminds us that status cannot erase biology or human emotion. Closing this part, so, as we rest here tonight, gently imagining candlelight flickering on ancient tapestries, remember that royal lives, despite the opulence, were messy, full of poor genetic choices, political marriages masquerading as love, and a quiet undercurrent of disappointment that no crown could hide. In the next section, we'll drift even further into the world of personal failings, petty kings, dysfunctional queens, and the curious ways their private lives often contradicted their public grandeur. For now, let the silk rustle softly. Let the drafts of European castles settle, and just breathe. Hey, Ebi, Guan. Tonight, we continue our gentle drift through history, moving from arranged marriages to the private quirks and quiet catastrophes of monarchy. These are the kings and queens whose reputations survived, often because they were unusually petty, unusually dysfunctional, or simply spectacularly unlucky. So dim the lights a little more. Let the day fade, and let's settle into the slow, clinking echoes of crowns and corridors. Louis XIV, the Sun King and his endless grievances. Louis XIV of France is famous. Naturally, the Sun King. Absolute power. Palaces the size of small towns. A court buzzing with intrigue. And of course, fashion that required daily assistance just to move. He was also, quietly, incredibly petty. Louis kept meticulous records of slights. Every insult, real or imagined, was catalogued for future reference. Which is exhausting. He had a habit of humiliating courtiers in tiny, creative walls. A man might be asked to bow for hours, to wear an absurd costume, or to walk into a room in exactly the wrong posture. Because, apparently, absolute power includes being a micromanager of dignity. And yet, Louis also had moments of grand generosity. It suited the image of the Sun King. The petty and the majestic coexisted quietly in perfect tension. A courtier's life was mostly about surviving small indignities, while hoping the king is sunlight didn't literally burn your eyebrows off. Even the terrible, petty yes, terrible, absolutely. Ivan IV of Russia, Ivan the Terrible, is famous for, well, terror. And yes, but beneath the fearsome reputation was a ruler with the smallest, most human insecurities magnified to epic proportions. He was suspicious of literally everyone. Family members included, court members, friends, even his own advisors were safe from sudden accusations or harsh punishments. His pettiest moment, by some accounts, involved ordering the execution of a man simply because he had received a compliment from a noblewoman. He also famously killed his own son, accidentally, during a fit of rage. Terrible, yes. Petty, yes. Human, also painfully, undeniably human. There is a certain grim comfort in knowing that even absolute power cannot always protect someone from personal failure. Henry VI of England, timid, confused, and easily upset. Henry VI of England was a king whose primary talent seemed to be avoiding conflict, which, for a monarch, is a dangerous skill set. He became king as an infant, naturally. He spent most of his life unsure what to do next. Decisions were made around him. Wars dragged on. Factions formed. Rebellions bubbled. Henry himself withdrew into pious contemplation. He founded colleges and monasteries, which is lovely in a quiet way, but completely inadequate for maintaining a kingdom under stress. He also had moments of fragile temper. Anger, depression, anxiety were quietly part of his rule. Ultimately, he was imprisoned and eventually died under mysterious circumstances, gently reminding us that being nice is not always a survival strategy for Marie Antoinette. Again, extravagance meets fragile society. We already mentioned Marie Antoinette in the context of her marriage. But there is more to her story that fits the theme of dysfunction, though not her own so much as the environment around her. Her extravagance, lavish dresses, enormous wigs, endless parties was real. But so was the intense scrutiny she faced. Rumors flourished, fueled by pamphlets and enemies of the crown. Every hairpin was a political statement, every pearl necklace an accusation. She was trapped between personal indulgence and public expectation, which, over time, contributed to her tragic end. There's a certain quiet sadness here. Royalty can be a stage, and sometimes the stage is a trap. No amount of grace or charm can fully escape the judgment of history or the Charles I of England. Drama and stubbornness. Charles I is an interesting example. He was deeply devoted to his own sense of dignity, and remarkably unwilling to compromise. He believed in the divine right of kings, which, in practice, meant refusing to negotiate with Parliament, which, predictably, led to civil war. Charles's stubbornness was legendary. He refused to flee. When rebellion threatened, he ignored advisors. He quarreled constantly. Eventually, this stubbornness led to his execution. And while he is remembered for his courage, there is something quietly instructive in his tale. Sometimes, being inflexible while wearing a crown has irreversible consequences. Catherine de' Medici. Subtle manipulation. Catherine de' Medici of France is a gentle reminder that queens, too, could be both petty and cunning. She was initially a foreign bride, married into a court that distrusted her, and so she learned subtlety. Catherine manipulated alliances, controlled royal children, and occasionally participated in deadly intrigue. Yet she was also deeply concerned with the survival of her family, often working behind the scenes in ways that were exhausting, unappreciated, and sometimes morally ambiguous. Her life reminds us that power can require endless calculation, quiet scheming, and occasional ruthlessness, all while trying to appear dignified in public. Peter the Great. Modernization, obsession, and awkwardness. Peter I of Russia, known as Peter the Great, is often remembered for modernizing Russia. He introduced Western technology, reformed the army, and built a new capital. But Peter was also socially awkward, obsessively he enjoyed practical jokes, sometimes cruel, on unsuspecting nobles. He could humiliate court members for trivial mistakes, because absolute power allows small vindictive pleasures. And yet, he fundamentally changed Russia, a combination of innovation, obsession, and tiny cruelties. A reminder that personal quirks, no matter how annoying, can coincide with historical significance. The gentle irony of dysfunction. When we look at these monarchs together, a pattern emerges. Absolute power often amplifies personal flaws. Pettiness becomes dangerous. Quirks become historical anecdotes. And private misery, boredom, or obsession can ripple outward, affecting millions. Kings and queens were, in some ways, children in crowns, subject to anxiety, insecurity, and boredom. And yet, their small personal failures could shape wars, policies, and entire countries. It's both amusing and quietly sad to observe. History, in this sense, is filled with people wearing grand titles, performing enormous responsibilities, and yet often failing at the smallest personal tasks: patience, humility, or basic human empathy. Closing this part, so as we drift softly towards sleep tonight, imagine the quiet moments behind the palace walls. A king adjusting his wig with exasperation, a queen rolling her eyes at endless courtly absurdities, a ruler scribbling grievances in a journal, hoping no one will notice. Royal life, despite the grandeur, was often just another form of human struggle, full of small failures, petty grievances, and the gentle chaos of imperfection. In the next section, we'll drift even further back to the beginning of life in royal courts. Sickly, spoiled, and fragile children. Medieval princes and princesses, whose futures were set before they could walk, and whose childhoods were surprisingly tragic. But for now, let yourself settle. Imagine the soft echo of tapestries, the distant flicker of candlelight, and the faint clink of tiny crowns. Hey everyone! Tonight, we drift even further back, away from adult kings and queens, political marriages, and courtly pettiness, and into the earliest stages of royal life, childhood, a time when power was promised, but comfort was scarce, and even the youngest princes and princesses were quietly negotiating survival, obedience, and boredom. So settle soften your gaze, and let the quiet melancholy of castles and nurseries wash over you. Royal babies. Precious, fragile, and always in danger, medieval royal babies were a paradox. Exceedingly precious, because they were future rulers. Exceedingly fragile, because medicine was medieval. Child mortality was high, very high. Royal families were no exception. Sicknesses that today are trivial fever infections. A cough could be fatal. Yet these babies were also treated with a mixture of indulgence and strict expectation. They were swaddled, cherished, and watched endlessly, and simultaneously expected to someday rule, produce heirs, and maintain dynasties. Even infant play was often a quiet rehearsal for adulthood, handling objects carefully, learning to sit with dignity, responding to instruction. Play was never just play, it was training for courtly life. Edward of Westminster. A Childhood in Shadows. Edward of Westminster, son of Henry VI of England and Margaret of Anjou, was born into political chaos. His father, already indecisive and anxious, struggled with governance. His mother, fiercely ambitious, tried to shield him. Edward's childhood was dominated by war. Towns burned, armies marched. Allies turned on each other. He was a child who could barely walk before the constant threat of death surrounded him. Royal children often grew up faster than anyone would like. They learned diplomacy in whispered conversations. They were taught strategy before they could tie their own shoes. It's easy to romanticize a young prince's life with lavish gowns and toys, but Edward's short life reminds us that precious often comes with invisible burdens. Blanche of Castile. Rigorous upbringing. Blanche of Castile, mother of Louis IX of France, offers a quieter example. She was a child expected to grow into immense responsibility. Her education was strict. Manners, religion, strategy, linguistique were all taught from a very young age. Playtime existed only in controlled bursts. Blanche herself, as a queen mother, later enforced similar expectations on her children. Her life illustrates the cycle of rigid upbringing, careful preparation, and the quiet melancholy that accompanies endless expectation. Spoiled? Yes, but often unhappy. Royal children were often spoiled in material terms. Velvet, silk, gold embroidery, tutors on every subject, gifts upon gifts. Yet material comfort did not equal happiness. They were constantly watched, critiqued, and trained. They rarely saw family affection in the modern sense. And failure, however small, was a political liability. Many children were sent away to other courts for education or alliances. Separated from parents, siblings, and familiars, they were literally raised as commodities, with human needs secondary to political aims. Richard II, a child king with too much power. Richard II of England became king at the age of 10. Technically a child, practically a monarch. He was educated in luxury and expected to rule. His tutors taught him diplomacy, rhetoric, and how to sit still for hours. But political realities did not respect childhood. Rebellions, advisors, and nobles circled him like hawks. A child king could not refuse anyone. His reign was dominated by others' ambitions, and the pressures of early authority left long shadows on his personality. Vanity, paranoia, and insecurity. Child kings often experienced isolation. Even with advisors and nobles around, few could offer real companionship. They were surrounded, always, by adults with agendas. Princesses, education, beauty, and birding girls fared differently, but equally difficult. Royal princesses were trained for marriage and diplomacy, not leadership, though sometimes they had to rule anyway. Education emphasized etiquette, religion, and artistic skills. Music, embroidery, poetry. They were expected to be beautiful, clever, obedient, and charming. Childhood illnesses, confinement, and constant observation were common. And while boys might practice swordplay and diplomacy, girls practiced compliance and subtle influence. Even a playful game could become instruction for future alliances. See how you negotiate for that toy? Practiced years before marriage negotiations. The psychological toll, all this training, expectation, and observation had consequences. Many royal children grew into adults with fragile anxiety, melancholy, obsession with control were natural responses to a childhood spent under watchful eyes. Some were resilient, some were deeply unhappy. Some, tragically, never survived childhood, and those who did often carried these early pressures into every decision, every marriage, and every reign. The quiet tragedy of royal upbringing. Unlike stories of grand wars or political intrigue, childhoods leave a quieter trace. The The sleepless nights of parents, worried about heirs, the faint cries in drafty nurseries, the endless lessons, instructions, and corrections. Royal children often experience a life of extremes, excess and deprivation, freedom and constraint, comfort and fear. And as they grew, these early experiences shaped the monarchy itself. Brittle personalities, fragile health, and subtle emotional wounds influenced decisions, alliances, and even battles. It's a gentle reminder that even the most glamorous childhoods were often lonely and full of quiet suffering. Closing this part tonight, let's linger on these shadowed nurseries. Imagine tiny hands clutching velvet cushions, imagine whispered lessons in cold, silent corridors. Imagine the weight of a kingdom pressing down on shoulders barely tall enough to reach the table. Royal childhoods were not carefree. They were sickly, spoiled, and sad. And yet, they shaped history in ways we often overlook. As we drift closer to sleep, let the soft echoes of their early lives settle around you. A reminder that power begins not in adulthood, but in tiny, vulnerable beginnings. In the next section, we can start gently reflecting on the quieter patterns of dynastic misfortune, personal quirks, and small tragedies that echo through centuries tying together Japan, Europe, and all the oddly human details of royalty that history remembers, but often misses. Tonight, we drift toward the final reflections of our long, slow journey, from misty feudal Japan to grand European palaces, from petty, anxious kings to fragile royal children. Now, let's simply observe the quiet patterns that tie all of this together. The little human truths beneath crowns, armor, and silk. Repetition across time and place. History has a peculiar habit of repeating itself. Dynasties rise and fall. Children inherit not just crowns, but anxieties, illnesses, and sometimes aljo shapes. Power magnifies flaws, and wealth does not protect against human vulnerability. In Japan, samurai grew anxious over stipends. In Europe, kings fretted over heirs. Across continents, rulers were just people, small, fragile, and often overwhelmed. There is a gentle irony here. Those who seem all-powerful are often the most constrained. Their choices are limited by politics, family, or health. Their failures are quietly amplified by the very systems meant to elevate them. The weight of expectation. Dynastic misfortune often stems from a single, quiet source: expectation. Royal children are expected to become perfect rulers. Princes must be brave, wise, and disciplined. Princesses must be clever, beautiful, and obedient. Marriages are negotiated to cement alliances, not love. Mistakes are magnified. Small missteps echo for decades, shaping wars, succession crises, and public opinion. And as we've seen, genetics occasionally punishes repeated patterns. The Habsburg jaw is a subtle, yet persistent reminder that even careful planning cannot escape biology. It's fascinating to see how these private struggles ripple outward, shaping not just a family but entire nations. And quietly tragic, too, because these pressures often fell on children who could hardly defend themselves. Petty behavior as survival. Many rulers we discussed were petty. Louis XIV, Ivan the Terrible, Charles I. They all displayed micro-level pettiness. Yet, perhaps, this pettiness is understandable. Absolute power is isolating. Being watched constantly can make even the wisest monarch obsess over the smallest detail. And sometimes, small acts of control or humiliation are just attempts to survive in a world that is always judging you. Pettiness becomes a survival strategy, a tiny, private rebellion against expectation, a way to assert control when the stakes are impossibly high. Fragility behind the throne. Royalty is often imagined as invincible, cloaked in gold, shielded by armies, untouchable by ordinary concerns. And yet, we've seen the opposite. Child kings, overwhelmed by responsibility, queens exhausted by scrutiny, princes ill, anxious, or simply unhappy in lives preordained before birth. Even the most celebrated rulers, Peter the Great, Louis XIV, Elizabeth of Bavaria, were, at heart, human, susceptible to boredom, vanity, melancholy, and fatigue. Perhaps that is the comforting truth. No crown, no matter how heavy, can erase humanity. A gentle reminder of perspective as we settle further into the quiet night. Let's consider what this long drift through history teaches us. Power does not guarantee happiness. Wealth does not protect from fragility. Even those elevated above ordinary life are shaped by small anxieties, childhood pressures, and the subtle consequences of poor choices. And yet, life goes on. Empires rise and fall. Royalty, samurai, peasants all live, struggle, and leave traces that echo softly through time. It's oddly soothing to realize that history is filled with the same small human truths we see today. Insecurity, ambition, boredom, and the quiet, patient effort to survive another day. The soft echo of history. Imagine the flickering candlelight in a Japanese castle, the distant clink of chains or armor in a European palace, the quiet scribbles of a young prince's tutor, or the hushed steps of a queen pacing her chambers at midnight. History is full of these moments, small, fragile, sometimes absurd. And when we look at them slowly, without judgment, they become gentle reminders that the past is made of ordinary people, living extraordinary lives, by accident, sometimes by tragedy, always with very human flaws. Closing thoughts. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, let the echoes of these centuries surround you. The anxious samurai, quietly counting coins. The nervous princess, learning manners in a cold nursery. The petty, awkward, or exhausted kings and queens, doing their best under impossible circumstances. History is a lullaby of human imperfection, a soft hum of ambition, failure, and quiet endurance. And while the events themselves are long past, the feelings fear, hope, boredom, ambition are timeless.